Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Hi, good morning to all of you all, and I'm Rajesh, and I'm joined by my team members, Shafi and Varki, who's our landscape consultant. The project is called Anandavana. Here, next, please. Shafi. So when we initially, this just basically run through the concept and the actual design intervention and what the master plan really is. Next, please. So in terms of the concept, our reference, can you go forward? So we were thinking about, our reference was about inhabiting terrain in monsoon terrain, and how traditionally habitation has always been located. If you look at the section below, on high ground, and the low ground sort of accommodates different levels of wetness through the year. And what's interesting is that along the gradients between high and low ground, you have these sort of practices of cultivation, which are sort of seasonal and temporal in nature. So this is something which we referred to as, in terms of some idea of a reference to temporal landscapes. Next, please. And looking at probably what the evolution of this kind of the Raja Kalave, the Nala itself, probably was a broad swale, which of sort of low ground, and typically there would be some kind of cultivation along the gradients, and a variation in sort of water levels or wetness through the seasons. And this is then being transformed as a part of the urban kind of intervention into a constricted sort of a hard channel, so basically you're trying to contain water. And so we question this approach of this hard channel approach, which actually constricts flows and is part of the larger problem of flooding that we experience in our cities. And so what we propose is something really, working within the framework, is really an intervention with a sort of a step gradient, which works within the framework that of what already exists, but also accommodates possibilities of variation in wetness and water levels over the year, but actually becomes an accessible kind of a space. Next, please. The other specific observation, besides all the normal stuff about the site, was right through this neighborhood, Kalyanagar, and actually in Bangalore, citizens have really gone out of their properties to cultivate and to garden. And this is very evident in our site all along Nala and even in the neighborhood itself. So there is this green thumb kind of instinct, which seems to be really strong. And then at the same time, you see at one end, you have the nurseries which are there. And of course, we have the broader context of, the totas and the Huvina totas, the flowers, and even the commercial aspect, which, of flower selling and all that. So this was another sort of a reference point, and we were really thinking of the link between what we were talking about earlier, the gradient and cultivation, and maybe bringing these together into some kind of synthesis. Next, please. So we were really, the question was, can you construct a sort of a pedestrian paradise, pedestrian-friendly environment? That's taken for granted that you want to go in that direction. But can one really create a pedestrian paradise with a vibrant, with sort of community gardens, and which also has, through these processes, an inbuilt resilience to floods? You get a broad picture of the, just hold on to that a second, of the basically the way we'll explain the details of the section as we go forward, but there's just a broad idea in terms of how these three things come together. Yeah, go ahead. Next, please. So the specific kind of intervention that we are doing, okay, we have some goals in mind. We're talking about productive landscapes, therefore, urban farming, community gardens. Then, of course, everybody wants more space available, friendly pedestrian, space for recreation. So you're talking about play areas, walking, plazas. And then, of course, at that intersection, there's the idea of including everybody, and all the good practices, universal access, place for the vendors, uh, communal market days, and of course, visibility. That's a very important part. Making all urban spaces visible, gender and age friendly. Then, of course, mobility with an accent on, enhancing pedestrian sort of friendly networks. And, there's already a lot of, with sensing local, and local residents have already been quite active in this area of really pushing, for pedestrian rights. And I think that one would like to build on that, creating systems of slow traffic with rationalized road widths, and of course, seamless movement in, across, and around the low ground. And then, of course, with all this, there is a sort of hidden system which also looks at the ease of flow in kind of extreme conditions, porosity, recharge, holding tanks, etc. Next, please. So when you look at the existing section, you have this very sort of undifferentiated, kind of very wide road in terms of what is there, in terms of what it's servicing. And then if you have this, the fence around the nala, because by default, when you have a space which is inaccessible, which is the nala, the hard channel, invisible, it is prone to abuse. And then to prevent people from throwing things inside, you create an inaccessible zone around it. So pretty much you create the problem, and then you expand the problem, and just make it more difficult for people. And actually what you're losing is space. So as you move forward, I mean, like if you kind of rethink that, hard division between high and low, and then actually look at it as a gradient and possibly an accessible stepped gradient, you create more space by rationalizing the road and parking. And then you sort of look at this possibility of this cultivation. And then as a last layer, you have the pedestrian walkways at two levels. You have an upper walkway, a lower walkway, and of course the bridge crossings, which sort of interweave the human sort of intervention with the landscape. Next, please. So we'll move forward to the actual design, and so the master plan. One second. Yeah. So you can go ahead. Yeah. So what you're really talking about is at the third cross, starting from left. I'll just quickly run through. You have the sort of a plaza, which is a communal plaza for events that could be temporary on particular days of the week, and you actually can continue the paving across that area and creating space for vendors, and you actually could block that off on these Sunday days. Where actually you could sell the produce of your communal gardens. And then you have, you have a series of sort of kunds which are along the low ground of the canal itself, which are located strategically where you have points at which the flows come in from the streets, because the streets is effectively the street network becoming the drain network, which actually kind of feeds the existing nala. And then, of course, you extend the high ground, and actually retain parts of the old nala wall. So you're actually talking about opening up the nala and retaining parts of the wall and extending the high ground there. And then at these points, you have the bridge crossings, which happen, again, which are loosely connected with the street network. Pause platforms which happen along the way, along these extended sort of upper levels. And again, the connection, you have another step sort of water retention going happening there, that cross nala sort of comes and connects. And yeah, and then, we've actually looked at, being this idea of the temporal landscape that actually that you can actually move down into the nala, and you have this sort of meandering path, which we call the path of bliss, which sort of winds its way through, this kind of cultivated landscape and gardens. And these community gardens which occur. And If you look at how the sort of street section has been looked at, and you have the residential buildings, and then okay, you leave a lane for parking because everybody parks on the streets. These are smaller plots, and you really need to keep that parking. And then you rationalize the road width to a slow movement, six meter wide roadway, and so you gain space really for your pedestrian areas. And then you have the sort of so 8 feet for the walkway and 16 8.5 meters for the landscape area. And so that's how that section is sort of organized. Next, please. And then, of course, the planting would be organized, along, sort of graded according to, from dry to moist to wet species. And, if you are, obviously we're not going into details of that. Yes, can we move forward? And then, of course, we'll just go on, focus on individual parts. So if you look at the communal, the third cross intersection, and they're really talking about extending the paving there and actually creating a division. It's actually a very dangerous intersection because people sort of cut across diagonally in this area, and from the two sides of the of the Nala. And so we're actually creating a division there, also trying to slow the traffic down. And then, of course, you provide space for the vendors and auto rickshaws and things like that. And this can be sort of blocked off on special events where you actually sell the community garden produce. Forward. And then, of course, this sort of seamless mobility. So you have this high-level mobility, which is connected to the street, and then you have the lower meander, and then, of course, the bridge crossings. You can also see some of the points at which water drains into this area. And then, of course, the lower path, which winds its way through these gardens with these pause kind of spots. So our approach has been as really that this is a stormwater drain, and there shouldn't be sewage going into it. And actually, I cross this Nala every day for the last 20 years, and you actually, what you have is a trickle of some illegal sewage that comes in, and 99.9% of the year there is no actually water in it. There is, other than the sewage, there is no actually stormwater flowing in it. So actually, even when it rises to what we've seen as the flood level, probably less than half of the existing Nala, it actually happens only for a few hours. And the flooding that happens outside it is mainly because water is actually not able to flow into it. So it's actually should be looked at as an area which is accessible for 350 days a year. And then, sorry,
I was just going to say, if you could wrap up, that would be great.
Yeah. So we have a system of overflows and how the flood mitigation happens. Go ahead. And then, of course, so this is the path, maybe a little romantic, but as you descend into the space, sort of the city disappears and the whole hustle and bustle, and you sort of enter sort of a liminal realm of a secret garden or a forest in the city. Thank you.